The British royal family was in crisis even before the Queen died and the new King and Princess of Wales both became ill with cancer.
It has been an incredibly tough couple of months for our entire family.
In an age of social media and conspiracy, how is Britain's relationship with monarchy changing? I'm Chris Stone, and this is the New Statesman podcast. I'm joined by the journalist and author Tanya Gold, whose latest essay, The Fragile Crown, is the cover feature of this week's New Statesman magazine. In it, she addresses the successive crises that have beset the royal family and what the public response tells us about our relationship with the monarchy and Britain's national story. Tanya, thanks for joining the New Statesman podcast. I believe the original pitch for this essay was to argue that the monarchy is over. Now, we've pulled back slightly from that, both with the cover story and with the theme of this podcast, but the theme does run through your piece that, as you say, the contortions required of the royal family no longer work, and you say that's been made obvious by the response to the Princess of Wales' illness. How would you describe the contortions that we require of the royals?
Well, monarchy is an ancient system, right? And the world has had monarchies for far longer than it's had liberal democracies. And you could say, in a way, we are more used to them. They seep into our subconscious. One of the things people used to say about the late Elizabeth II is that almost everyone in the country at some point or another would have dreamt about her. So already we've got these sort of dream figures rooted in history and legend and myth. But we have such a different world now. And the fact that the British monarchy, which is the second oldest monarchy in the world after Japan, has hung on is far more a curio than anything else. It's sort of survived by accident. We all know that after the First World War, the crowns of Europe toppled like nine pins. They all left, but ours survived. So we have this ancient system at the top. But of course, around that and under it, the world has changed. We are far more secular. Except here, the churches are mostly empty, though I think that will probably change, but that's for another podcast and another feature. So we're much more secular. We have a dogma of equality and fairness, though we do not always follow it through. These are accepted beliefs. And yet at the top, we have the preeminent example of inherited wealth and power in the entire world. And two different groups are trying to negotiate this. One is the people, the subjects, and one is the monarchy at the top. And I think in that contradiction and in those strivings, we're seeing everything that has come to a head in recent months.
And of course, in the past few months, both the King and the Princess of Wales have become ill with cancer. As listeners will remember, Charles's illness was briefed quite simply. The palace issued a statement that cancer had been discovered as part of a treatment for an enlarged prostate. But Catherine's wasn't so straightforward. It was announced that she was having planned surgery and would be absent from public life until Easter. But then Prince William pulled out of an event at the last minute. Her public appearance at Trooping the Colour in June was announced and then retracted, and conspiracy theories started to spring up, especially on social media. They went, the marriage was over and she was dead. And the palace, of course, didn't help matters, issuing a weirdly manipulated photo. And then finally, Catherine herself appeared in a video announcing that she had cancer and was receiving preventative chemotherapy. Tanya, what were your observations while all this was going on? And what does it tell us about Britain's relationship with monarchy?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that I don't think that the King and the Princess of Wales being sick are by themselves a crisis. People get sick all the time. They need to be allowed to be sick. But I do think that that the reports and the way that it was handled and the way that people responded is exposing a crisis for monarchy, and with it a crisis for the country. I think far more significant than these announcements of illness, than these facts of illness, are two other things that we're talking about a little bit less at the moment. The first was the exposure, or rather the involvement of the King's brother, the Duke of York, in a sex scandal in New York, after which he had to lose his HRH title and is basically exiled from public life. So we have this instance of corruption and unfitness right at the top. And the other one, of course, is the self-exile of Prince Harry, who we all know he wrote a whistleblowing book called Spare. I read it as a whistleblowing book. Other people see it as sour grapes. And his story of the cruelty and the frigidity inside monarchy, of how impossible it is. And of course, Harry's had a front seat all his life, how impossible it is for him to live inside the system, of how cruel and dehumanizing, and in the end for his mother, deadly, this system is out there for all to hear if only we would listen. So I think it was a system that was already in crisis. And then with these announcements of the sickness and the crazy response to it, it became exposed.
And what do you think the public reaction to that tells us about our relationship with monarchy?
Well, of course, the conspiracy theories were not universal. Not everyone was going on Twitter and saying really cruel and agonizing things about people who, I have to remind seemingly everybody, are real people. It was the collusion in it. And that was even that sort of decent, normal, sane people who aren't always on Twitter and aren't writing that the princess is anorexic or has had a nose job or her husband has betrayed her or is dead. We're treating it with a really obscene kind of levity. And that did seem to be rather universal. And I look back and I think this is exactly what happened to Princess Diana, but it's worse. We are no longer treating these people as human beings with rights. And what I found most awful about the recording she did from the bench when she said that she was receiving treatment for cancer is the way that she thanked us. And she thanked us right off the bat.
I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you personally for all the wonderful messages of support and for your understanding whilst I've been recovering from surgery.
And I thought that was really obscene, because she has been the focus of a global maelstrom of bullying and dehumanization. And yet she had to sit there and thank us, or she felt she had to sit there and thank us. And I think that gets right to the crux of the way that we treat the royal family, which is, on the one hand, we expect them to be immaculate and perfect and never say anything and never do anything. And that was the model that developed under Elizabeth II. Queen Mary once said, and I'm paraphrasing, we love infrastructure. We are infrastructure. They're like mountains. They're like municipal swimming baths. They're supposed to sit there and stay the same and smile and be brilliantly and immaculately British so we can get on and do whatever we're doing, which usually, in my analysis, seems to be being really quite infantile and throwing away liberal democracy with both hands. So we have this expectation of them. But on the other hand, then we have a second desire, which is to tear them to pieces. We are so much more interested in them when they make mistakes, when they're unhappy, when they screw up. So there's a contradiction there. And I think that is the contradiction that is deadly and vicious. And I just wonder how much longer this can go on, because I think we're going to look back on Elizabeth II as a kind of anomaly. It was Churchill who said that if you were going to cast somebody to be queen, you couldn't think of anyone better. For whatever reason, and I'll tell you my theories if you want, she was absolutely perfect at it. And she was born at the right age as well. She didn't have to struggle with social media. She was already into her 80s when that happened. She had a supportive partner in a stable marriage. You know, she was sane. For some reason, it bounced off her, that whatever madness emerged, it bounced off her. But I really don't think that the new generation are like that. And I am a Republican. I don't think it's an adult way to run your country. There's an argument for monarchy, that it fills the space, it stops anything else more toxic filling the space. It protects us from Trump, it protects us from Caesar. But the problem with that is human nature, that old caveat. And I really think that what we're expecting of them is impossible.
In one striking part of your essay, you repeat, with a touch of irony, the refrain that the system never fails, only the people. And you provide a long list of individuals who seem to have either been chewed up and spit out by the royal machine or been mired in crises of their own making, as some of the people you've just alluded to. Is anyone in the royal family happy, do you think?
I wrote in another essay for the New Statesman on Prince Harry that having projected onto him for a lifetime, I can't stop now. And I had this weird fantasy that he would become a tree surgeon and give up his title, and then he would achieve true emancipation. And the truth is, I can't tell you if they're happy, but they certainly don't look very happy. I went to Balmoral 2 days after Elizabeth II died, and there was this bizarre carnival of people laying flowers, people weeping. The press were allowed to approach the mourners, but you had to do it with a great deal of sensitivity. And if you had expressed a Republican thought, I suspect you would have been chased out of town. And then the royal family came out, all the late Queen's children except the King. And they stood there, we were put behind a rope, and we just stared at them while they came and looked at the flowers. And I mean, of course, they were grieving, but I couldn't escape the thought, this is torture. We are torturing them with our attention. The King, who, and it was in his mid-70s when he ascended to the throne, didn't have time to process his grief like you and I or any other person would be allowed to do. He immediately had to embark on a tour of Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland to show his fitness in this strange relic of feudalism. I mean, we do have some stuff on the record, of course. Prince Harry, obviously an incredibly unhappy man, who's talked about how he has PTSD from being royal. He talked about how when he was a child and his mother would be driving them around London, I believe this was after she lost her HRH and she lost her royal protection. And the reason she lost her royal protection is because she no longer trusted the royal family because of the Martin Bashir episode, when he sent her all this false information that meant that she no longer trusted anyone within the royal machine. And Prince William said later that it caused her a great deal of grief and heartbreak in her later years. So she had lost her protection, and she would drive around London, and paparazzi would follow her, and they would call her a whore in front of her children to try and get the reaction shot of her shouting or her screaming or her losing her cool. It's the duality again, you know, the immaculate princess and then the raging human being. And Harry saw all this. He also has testimony about how when his father told him his mother died, the story we were told for years is that William and the now king soothed him and protected him and they were safe. What actually happened, according to Spare, is that his father told him as well as he could, and then he left him to it. He left this child sitting in a cold bedroom at Balmoral with the news that his mother had died. And there were so many incidents, and it was very interesting, Spare, also on how the royal family would process this emotional cauterization that's inflicted on them for survival. He talks about going to stay at some friends of his father's, the Van Cutsons, and they have lots of children, and their idea of a game was to send Harry to drive off. This was on private land, of course, on an estate, in a Land Rover, and they would follow him with guns, shooting at him. And he said, you know, I loved it. And the other example which really struck me was when he shot a deer with a gamekeeper at Balmoral, and they went to get the carcass of the deer. And the gamekeeper stuffed Prince Harry, then his child, he stuffed his head inside the carcass. And then, of course, there was having to walk behind the coffin. And he talks about hearing the shutters of the cameras and hearing the weeping of people who had never met his mother, and yet he wasn't allowed to cry. You know, he had to stand there, stiff shoulders, marching with his soldier father, his soldier brother, his soldier grandfather, listening to the howling of the people. And I feel, you know, nothing really but admiration for him that he left. I know it's only a partial emancipation. He still thinks he can be a progressive prince. I still think he should hand in the title, but that's not a decision for me. We can go further back in history, if you like. The late Queen's sister, Princess Margaret, was not allowed to marry the man that she loved, Group Captain Peter Townsend, without losing her royal title. The late Elizabeth II once said, and I believe she said this of Harry and Meghan, you can't be half in and half out, you know, and how true that is. Princess Margaret was not bred to live outside the royal family. She wasn't raised not to have a title or to be a housewife in Belgium with group captain Peter Townsend to be Mrs. Townsend, and she had enough self-awareness to know that. So they didn't marry, very famously, and she married somebody else on the rebound, somebody who was involved with somebody else. The marriage was a complete bin fire, and she coped as best she could. And to go back one further generation before I stop, of course, we had Edward VIII, who wanted to marry a twice divorced American woman, and that, of course, wasn't allowed. He said that he couldn't reign without her, he couldn't reign alone, and so he gave up the crown and spent the rest of his life being traduced for it. I don't think that being a member of the royal family is conducive to emotional health and to happiness. And I think it's interesting, and I mean, I can only speak from what I've observed, you know, we can't crawl inside their souls much as we would like to. The ones who do seem most functional and happy are the ones who haven't been given royal titles due to the intervention of their parents. So the Princess Royal's children don't have titles and they seem functional. We certainly haven't heard anything to the contrary. And Princess Margaret's children did also not receive titles at the intervention of their mother, and they also seem plausibly happy. I really do believe that in a constitutional monarchy, the best argument for republicanism is, are we really going to go on treating them like this?
And do you think, I mean, you've listed examples through sort of going quite far back in history, but I think the thing that's changed in recent decades has been the way that we participate as the public in that game. You describe in your article that we want them to be gods, but we treat them as dolls. You know, there's these sort of these deities that we toy with, and do you think that something fundamental has changed in recent decades, maybe since Diana or more recently, about the way that the public interacts with monarchy? And what do you think that means for the concept of monarchy going forward?
I certainly think that until the mid 20th century, monarchy was a very well-established system in this country. It was very popular, and there was a huge amount of respect. The press was very respectful. They treated them with kid gloves. They treated them as they wished to be treated. And I think when we go back and look over it, I think if you are going to have a constitutional monarchy, a respectful distance is going to be the only thing that works. And you had that until then. The Queen barely got any bad press till the 70s. In the famous year, and then there was a famous documentary about them, and it got in way too close, and there was a bad reaction from the public, and then they stopped doing it.
He did have some very strange habits, your father. I remember when I used to come up to Royal Lodge, I asked when I arrived on if it was the king, and they said, oh, he's in the garden, and I went out and there's nothing to be seen except a lot of terribly rude words and language coming out of a rhododendron bush. So I eventually found him there hacking away, wearing a bearskin cap. Which was, he's getting ready. Yeah.
They were treated very well by the newspapers. I mean, the most famous example, of course, is when George V died. Again, going quite a way back, but I always say the Windsors have soaring archives and very long memories. You know, they've been charged for 1,000 years, so 100 years is nothing. And when he died, they didn't want the death to be reported in the less respectful evening papers. They wanted it in the Times. So in the evening, his doctor basically euthanized him to make the announcement in the Times, which is where they wanted it to be. So they were protected. In my view, the best writer on monarchy in recent years has been Hilary Mantel, and she wrote an amazing essay in The Guardian a couple of years ago about Princess Diana. And Hilary Mantel describes the day this changed. It was a September day in 1980, and Diana allowed herself, so credulous and guileless as she was then, she was only 19, to be photographed by the Sun's photographer Arthur Edwards with two children from the nursery Young England, where she worked, metaphor piles upon metaphor, and you could see all of her legs. The skirt was transparent. And I think that was when we moved from a respectful distance, or when we realized that we had moved from a respectful distance to wanting to get closer and closer and closer. And Diana was something completely different. The treatment of her was completely different. And she was completely different. She exposed, I think, and she was the first person to expose, absolutely, how toxic this system is if you are not temperamentally suited for it, as the late Queen was. Within months, She was throwing herself downstairs. She was harming herself. Her bulimia, which until then had been fairly settled, went rampant. It was a cruel system. And instead of backing off and thinking, okay, maybe if we want to have a constitutional monarchy and we want them to be as sane as they possibly can be, we need to back off, we didn't. And Diana was the first royal media superstar. She eclipsed her husband. That was part of the reason, I understand, that their marriage fell apart. Envy and jealousy. They know that this system is unstable. They know that our affection is whimsical, and they brief against each other, and they compete to be top of the rankings. But Diana was bewitching. She was bewitching because she was brave and she was interesting and she couldn't hide her feelings. And we know what happened. What began within, I'm sure Arthur Edwards of the Sun thought was an innocent and feel-good picture of a woman's legs, ended with photographers taking pictures of a woman who was dying in a tunnel in Paris, and then questions at the later inquest about whether she was pregnant or not, literally wanting to peer inside her body. And people were really shocked after Princess Diana died. And you might think that we might have learned, and of course there were these changes, and the newspaper editors, they were offered photographs of Diana dying in a car, and they were very proud of themselves that they didn't publish them. And we said they'd learned, but they didn't. We cannot treat them with any compassion. And it's always the women who get it worst. I mean, look, even Catherine Middleton, you know, who seems to be an impeccable person doing her best. I mean, my issue is with monarchy and what it does to our country and how it infantilizes us and how it prevents us from being dynamic. It makes us look backwards, not forward, into this, you know, imperial dream world, which has long fled if it ever really existed. But I have no argument with them. She seemed to me to be an immaculate person who always did her best. Weighty Katie, they called her, because William was so anxious about putting somebody else through what his mother went through that it took him a long time to make up his mind that they would get married, and possibly a long time for her as well. And then all the snobbery around her mother. I mean, the phrase doors to manual, which they used to say about Catherine Middleton's mother, Carol, you know, both her parents are self-made. You know, this is admirable. You know, we're supposed to be a nation of shopkeepers. You know, this is supposed to be admirable. And yet they said she was doors to manual. That should never have been published in a newspaper. You know, it's not in the public interest. And again, with Meghan was bullied by the British media. And I think what was interesting about the response to Meghan is there was something for everyone. You know, in one part of the newspaper, there'd be a Meghan is great. And in the next part of the newspaper, there would be a Meghan sucks. This isn't normal. This isn't normal behavior. I don't blame her at all. I mean, of course you can say, you know, don't read it. But, you know, as they say about all forms of insanity, and I think, you know, monarchy is insanity for us and for them. You know, if you're mad, you can't wish yourself sane. It's not good enough to say, oh, just don't read it. You know, she was torn apart in the British media. And that's just not an acceptable way to behave. There were headlines after her wedding saying that she tried to poison Princess Charlotte with lilies. And then there was all the stuff about Tiara Gate and the tights fight. And again, I don't think any of this is in the public interest. I don't want to read any of this stuff. But of course I read it all.
When I first met my now husband, my friends were really happy because I was so happy. But my British friends said to me, I'm sure he's great, but you shouldn't do it because the British tabloids will destroy your life.
And I don't blame her that she found it untenable. I mean, my own theory about Meghan is the same as my theory about Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, which is they wanted to get out. So they married people who would be their life rafts. You know, Meghan is too American and too Californian. She had her own life before this. She was never going to put up with this for long. And I know that they behaved very, very strangely, and the announcement of the birth was sort of botched and weird. But what you're dealing with here, in my opinion, is two incredibly angry people who just don't want to put up with it anymore. And I saw them when she was heavily pregnant. I saw them at the Natural History Museum. They were going to an event. And they walked out, and there were hundreds of flashbulbs. I mean, things have changed since the 1970s, when there'd be one reporter on the royal rota and a curtsy. And I don't really believe in that either. But I think we have to accept that I think this is getting quite close to a sickness. You know, when the behavior of the media, which of course is all fueled by people's desire to read about it. You can't just blame the newspapers. They wouldn't do it if it didn't sell. This is not normal behavior, and it's not suited to, an adult country with a population that vote. And also, my other real objection to this is, while we're talking about all this really destructive bunk, because it's gossip really, we're not talking about things that really matter. And I mean, all readers of the New Statesman are well aware of what really matters and what's actually happening to our country, and how child poverty is hitting 40% in some areas, and the absolute, devastation and decimation of communities, and everything that means for the future of our country. And in the meantime, we're obsessing about a stranger's marriage and health. It's not right.
But it's not just journalists, right? We are participating in this like never before through social media. We have this these women largely in public life who people claim to love, but perhaps love borders into obsession and a sense of ownership. What does that say about us?
I think it's very interesting that you use the word love, because I don't think it's love at all, though I think they say it's love so they can live with themselves. What it really is a massive act of projection, which goes back to what monarchs were originally supposed to be, which is sort of scapegoat and God at the same time. They would protect us, but they would also be our sin eaters. They had a very important symbolic role at the heart of society. And I think that this is a superannuated postmodern version of this. People project onto them. I can be so beautiful. I can have this life, this glorious gilded life. I can be the princess in the castle, and yet I can't do it. So she's going to do it for me. But then we've also begun to project our more destructive and darker tendencies onto them as well. I mean, it's a very bizarre thing to watch. This combination of adoration on the one hand and a desire to destroy by. I mean, we literally want to turn them inside out now. The Prince of Wales had to tell us what was inside her. Cancer. So I think we're treating them as these bizarre totems, and I think the reason we do that is because I think it's kind of fun, and it stops us having to look at our own lives. It's always been like this.
You describe in your essay this idea that the British public are addicted to monarchy. How do we break that addiction?
I know it's an addiction because I watch The Last Night of the Prom sometimes, and I see when Land of Hope and Glory comes on, and everyone goes crazy. The late imperial anthem, a fifth of the globe, a gorgeous royal family, it all belongs to us. And you can listen to that, even as a secular Jew, a secular Republican Jew, you can listen to that, and you can feel the drug in it. It allows us, this ideal of monarchy allows us to believe that our country is more important and more exceptional and more gilded than it really is, that we're better than other people, basically. And I think Elizabeth II, who presided over managed decline, I mean, all historians say that, it's perfectly obvious, it was an age of decline. She managed, with her skill, to sort of help us look away from that, to help us not realise that. And now she's gone. We're left with the reality, because her successors have an impossible job to do, which is to project an ideal of family and an ideal of country, which patently don't exist, while at the same time we're trying to tear them apart and look inside them. My own wish is that, I think they should abdicate. I'm absolutely certain that the Prince of Wales really, really loves his children, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if he abdicated. But what will probably happen, I suspect, is it will continue to go on. We seem to have become a nation of people who just allow ourselves to drift. It will go on until something so shocking happens, either something we do to them or they do to themselves, or they do. The Prince Andrew story wasn't great, that it just all falls apart. I mean, Elizabeth II's ratings were very, very solid, and remain so. We still poll on her about support for the monarchy among young people is dropping like a stone. And I think even towards the end of Elizabeth II's reign, it was an inch deep and a mile wide, and could melt away tomorrow.
Tanya Gold, thank you so much for joining the New Statesman podcast. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and leave a comment to let us know what you think. We release new videos every week, so make sure you subscribe to the New Statesman YouTube channel so you never miss an episode.